Good morning, FS 330 students. We're on the last week of class, so we just have a few more things to get done before the semester is all finished. I do appreciate everybody hunkering down and getting through this immediate change that we had related to coronavirus. It is not exactly how I envisioned how the semester being finished, but we made it through so far, and I appreciate that. It is due to your hard work and your responses to any questions that I have and giving me feedback about what's going on and if things are working or not. So please keep that up. If you've run into some issues with anything, let me know. For extra credit, you have your homework with chocolate, which opens this Friday, or opens Wednesday, actually, the 22nd, and closes Friday. So you have a total of 3 points you can get for completing that. And then watch that virtual NC State Dairy Tour and write a 250-word summary. And that's due by the 24th. It's open currently. You can go ahead and get that done. So that's 6 extra credit points that you can get added to your lowest test grade. I have reevaluated the exam 2 grades and added those to the grade book. I did reevaluate a few of the questions, particularly the cabbage color question was one of them. And then an egg yolk question that was on there. I think leaving the egg yolks out of the souffle. I also added a 5-point curve to that to compensate for a new type of testing format for me and for you being on Moodle. So those grades should be posted, and I believe you should be able to see them in the grade book. Nobody went down. If anything, everybody went up. So be aware of that. Your comprehensive final exam, which is online, open book and notes, that opens Wednesday, April 29th. So that's the Wednesday after the last day of class. And it's due that Friday, May 1st by 11:59 p.m. Keep in mind that 40% of the exam will be new material and 60% will be comprehensive. The way that comprehensive portion is structured is that you have 5 questions and you pick 3 of them to answer. So be aware of that as you look at the test on Moodle. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to structure it. It may just be that the last 5 questions are the ones that are the pick 3. I'll give you some instructions on that as well to make sure everybody's clear on it. But that's how it will be structured. So today we're going to be talking about chocolate and ice cream. So the beginning of chocolate is really quite an interesting story. And it begins in Mesoamerica, in what is now Central America. And with the ancient people, Aztec. This is a picture of an Aztec woman making a chocolate beverage where this chocolate beans were laid out and they fermented. Sometimes they would roast them in the fire, sometimes not. They would just be the dried roasted or dried fermented beans. They would grind that into a paste. Typically, there was not sugar involved in this. It was just the cocoa beans, maybe some spices, maybe vanilla, cinnamon, chili powder, that type of thing. And so this was ground into a paste, and then they made a beverage out of it, as seen here. And the typical way to make a beverage was to mix this paste with water and then pour it from up high into this container. And what this did is it created a very frothy beverage. So it created a foam. And in creating that foam, it kind of helped mitigate some of the astringency and bitterness that was present in that chocolate paste and in the chocolate beverage. So that was where chocolate started. Eventually, with exploration, Europeans came over to Mesoamerica and discovered chocolate and took it back to Europe. They developed European factories around 1580. That's when we started seeing European chocolate factories. In the 1600s, the chocolate beverage, just like what the Aztecs had produced, that beverage was the same in Europe up until this point. And around the 1600s, people began to add milk to it. And this was considered almost like a medicinal type of beverage. So this was used to settle the stomach, calm nerves, all of those types of things. but it did not have any sugar in it at this point, and it was really sort of gritty and oily. Definitely not what we think of as hot chocolate today. The Dutch then invented a screw press in the 1800s, and that allowed the cocoa butter to be pressed out of the cocoa. And so we just had this dry cocoa powder. This allowed mixing back into water, the cocoa powder back into water, and created a lighter beverage that wasn't so greasy and oily. And then we could start thinking about making solid eating chocolate, because up until this point, we really didn't have that much solid eating chocolate that was 100% chocolate. So once we could add back in the cocoa butter and the milk powder was invented, milk powder was invented around the 1800s in the Netherlands as well. Once these things could be added back in, we started seeing more of what we consider the typical eating chocolate now. But it was still quite gritty, not smooth and creamy like we think of, until the development of a conch. And this is a specific type of equipment or process that is used to reduce the particle size in chocolate until it's very smooth and creamy. So, chocolate is primarily started as a fermentation process. So, when chocolate is harvested, this is a picture of the raw cocoa pods, not anything like what we think of as chocolate today. So, these are the cocoa beans on the inside. They're coated with this pulp. The primary carbohydrate in the pulp is sucrose. And so this is a great environment for fermentation. So once the shell is cracked open, we have these seeds that are inside. Those are pulled out, and they undergo this fermentation process. And this is a multi-organism fermentation process that all occurs naturally. All of these organisms are present on the cocoa pods in the environment. So this is not anything that needs to have any of these organisms added to it. It's already all there for the making. So when we start off initially, yeast is the primary organism that is fermenting the cocoa pods. Just like yeast are fermenting the bread that we learned about, varieties of yeast are fermenting the sucrose in these cocoa pods in the pulp and turning that into carbon dioxide, ethanol, and acid. So ethanol is the primary byproduct of this fermentation initially. Acid as well. Once the pH of the pulp gets low enough acid has been produced, then lactic acid bacteria take over, and they begin to really pump out the acid. So their fermentation process, they're also consuming the sucrose that is there, but their main byproduct is going to be lactic acid. So that lactic acid further acidifies the pulp. And at this point, most of the oxygen in the mix has been used up by the yeast. Yeast, in order to multiply, require a lot of oxygen. So most of the oxygen has been used up. Lactic acid bacteria can grow in a mostly anaerobic environment. So they're fine, but eventually they produce enough acid that they stop growing. The third organism to take over is acetic acid bacteria. And this is the same type of bacteria, acetobacteria, that are used to turn wine into vinegar. So these bacteria actually consume ethanol and produce acid, acetic acid. So at this point, we've got more acid production with the acetic acid bacteria. Prior to this, the whole mix has been stirred. So we get oxygen consumption by the yeast, which produces ethanol, and lactic acid bacteria growth, which produces further acid. And at this point, no oxygen is there anymore because it's been consumed by the yeast. The workers then come in and stir the mixture. They actually transfer it from one bin to the next, and that aerates the mixture, putting in more oxygen, which then allows the acetic acid bacteria to start consuming some of that ethanol that was produced by the yeast and converting it to acetic acid. So at this point, the mixture has continued to get warmer and warmer and warmer as these bacteria ferment. Heat is a natural byproduct of fermentation. And so at this point, this is where we get a peak in temperature And by following that temperature, the farmer can understand where the fermentation is, right? We've got a constant increase in fermentation. And it's at that temperature peak that we want to stop, because once we go past this temperature peak, we start getting these spore formers growing and molds growing, and those can really be detrimental to the flavor of the overall chocolate, the end product. So we want to stop here with the acetic acid bacteria and prevent the growth of spore formers and molds. Once those beans have been fermented and dried, they're then sent to the manufacturer. And the manufacturer typically is the one responsible for roasting. During that fermentation process, lots of enzymatic breakdown has occurred. Enzymatic breakdown of proteins that are present within the beans, as well as carbohydrates and definitely lipids, lots of lipids there. So we've taken those polymeric molecules and broken them down into smaller molecules. And these smaller molecules are generally more reactive, whether it be protein amino acids or peptides, smaller molecular weight carbohydrates, so monodisaccharides or oligosaccharides, and then with lipids breaking down to fatty acids. So once we get those breakdown products, the roasting actually uses those breakdown products to create a lot of the flavors that we think of as very typical for chocolate. So that fermentation process creates a lot of flavor precursors that are then altered during the roasting process, and we get not only a lot of those Maillard browning products that we're really interested in, the caramelized nutty notes that are there, roasted notes. We also get a lot of the flavors that we typically think of as chocolate. Once these beans have been fermented, dried, and roasted, they are then ground. And this is a picture of cocoa nibs. So this is just breaking the beans apart, removing the outside hull of the beans. And this is just chunks of the interior of the beans. So you can see these cocoa nibs are quite big in particle size. They're further ground down to be even smaller, not quite to the point yet where we wouldn't detect them on our palate, but definitely smaller. And as these are ground down, it breaks up the cellular material and releases a lot of that cocoa butter, or allows that cocoa butter to be released. So then that product, after the cocoa nibs are ground down even further, is called chocolate liquor. And you can see here, this is a conch. And so this mixture that's here does not look smooth. So this is the chocolate liquor initially before it undergoes conching for sometimes as many as 24 hours, but at minimum about 3 hours. Before this gets added to the conch, typically we get other ingredients mixed in, like sugar, and any other type of, if we're using milk powder to make milk chocolate, that milk powder is added at this point. Conching is the process of taking two large stones over a base stone and rolling or kneading the chocolate between these two. It really works to reduce the particle size even further so that you get a very creamy texture. It also adds to the flavor. The chocolate at this point, or the chocolate liquor at this point, is quite astringent, so it's very drying on the palate, can be very bitter, and very coarse in texture. So the conching process actually, of course, with all this friction, heats the chocolate up just slightly. And this allows to volatilize a lot of that acid that was produced in the fermentation. So the conching really mellows the flavor by reducing the acid. It also causes interactions between those astringent compounds and proteins and lipids that are there, allowing them to be minimized, that astringency to be reduced. And the same with the bitterness. A lot of the compounds that cause bitterness are reduced in this conching process. So conching not only creates a very smooth, creamy texture, but it also minimizes some of those negative attributes of chocolate flavor, and really mellows out the taste of it. Once you have a very smooth chocolate, we move on to what's called tempering, and we'll talk about this even further. Tempering is selecting a cocoa butter crystal morphology. So cocoa butter crystals can exist in a number of different shapes, all having different melting points and different stabilities. So by tempering, we're selecting for the most stable melting point and one that's just a bit higher than body temperature. And then the chocolate is, of course, shaped into bars or molds. So let's talk about different types of chocolate. There's several different kinds. Of course, there is a standard of identity for chocolate, and it encompasses any of these top three. There is no standard of identity for dark chocolate compared to semi-sweet chocolate. All of these fall into the same category. So let's start with the most basic, baking chocolate. This is unsweetened. It has no sugar added to it. It is just the cocoa liquor with added cocoa butter. So we get about 50% of this chocolate being cocoa butter. So when you're adding baking chocolate, that solid baking chocolate that you can find in the baking section of the grocery store, you're adding a good bit of fat there. The rest of the product is going to be the actual cellular material from the chocolate nibs. So that's very fibrous, or not fibrous. It has a high fiber content. Okay, so cocoa. This is basically chocolate liquor that has had the fat removed, cocoa powder. So we usually have around 10 or 20% cocoa butter in cocoa powder. So this is very low concentration of cocoa butter, mostly just the powder. And then sweet or semi-sweet chocolate does have sugar added to it, and you have somewhere between 35 and 70% chocolate liquor, right? So this is just that ground chocolate beans with sugar added to it. Now, once you get hit to this point, you're going to start adding other ingredients such as milk, and milk is not added in its liquid form. Milk is added in as milk powder or solids. So milk chocolate, as defined, has to have greater than 10% chocolate liquor and greater than 12% milk solids. And that's really the only basic definition there. You can add in vanilla, more cocoa butter to the mix, other flavors. So this is basic milk chocolate. A lot of people talk about white chocolate not being chocolate at all, and there's some truth to that in that there's no chocolate liquor added. But white chocolate is a mixture that uses cocoa butter. So it has to have at least 20% cocoa butter and at least 14% milk solids, right? So this is like milk chocolate, but without the chocolate liquor, just the cocoa butter. So basically this is just fat, sugar, and sometimes milk. So those are different types of chocolates. What about cocoa powder or chocolate itself? Chocolate itself, when it's natural chocolate, has a pH around 5. So it's somewhat acidic. We talked a little bit about this with our quick breads section in discussing leavening. So if you are adding natural cocoa powder to your mix, it's likely to have this type of color. You can see here it's much more of a red-brown than the highly Dutched versions here, right? So this is natural cocoa powder that has not been treated, has not been Dutched. If you are adding that to your recipe, you must compensate if it's chemical leavening with some baking soda, because this is an acidic ingredient. Now, oftentimes products that are sold in the grocery store as cocoa powder are Dutched cocoa powder. And you'll probably see this on the label. That is a process. Dutching is a process of adding alkali to chocolate liquor or cocoa beans. So typically it's sodium carbonate or potassium carbonate that's added. This raises the pH to somewhere between 7 and 8, neutralizes it. Actually has the effect on the flavor of making it more neutral. So not quite as bitter and astringent. And you actually lose some of those caramelized, nutty type of flavors there because of the Dutching process. And you can see what an effect it has on color. So we start with a natural here, and this is the most highly Dutched product. The more alkali that's added, of course, the more difference in pH and flavor you're going to find. So as we start adding in sodium carbonate or potassium carbonate, you can see the color change. So it goes up here, and you can start seeing the darkening in the center more so than the edge. And as we move through these different brownies, this one being the final level of Dutching, you can see how much darker overall it gets. Now, as a brownie, you may think, oh my gosh, that looks terrible. It's black. Think of Oreos. Highly Dutched cocoa powder is what's used to make Oreos. They're very dark as well. So this has implications in baking because of the pH, but it also affects the flavor. So let's think about the structure of chocolate, and particularly solid chocolate. So chocolate is a system of cellular particles of the cocoa beans. So this is mainly fiber, right? Suspended in crystals of fat, right? So this is a fat continuous system. Remember when we talked about emulsions and how we had oil and water and oil systems? This is definitely a water and oil system, okay? So what we have is a lot of fat in chocolate, some fibrous cellular material, some crystalline sugar, and no more than about 1 to 3% moisture in this. So chocolate is a very, very low moisture system. We utilize tempering to select for the most thermodynamically stable fat crystal. All right, this gives us the best texture. We're really interested in having a chocolate bar that is very glossy and shiny, that does not melt at room temperature, and that has a really good snap when you break it, right? You can break it in half and hear that snap sound. This is all due to selecting the best, most stable fat crystal. So once we've gone through selecting that fat crystal, we're doing that with the temperature control, which we'll go over in just a second. Oftentimes what can happen is that fat crystal can change if there's temperature abuse of the chocolate. So let's say you leave your chocolate in the car, it gets a little warm. Some of those chocolate crystals, fat crystals, melt, and then they resolidify. That has the effect of changing the type of fat crystal that was selected for. So when that happens, you get this bloom on the outside of chocolate, and this isn't mold. This is a change in the fat crystal type. Okay, so the fat crystal on the outside of the chocolate is visibly different, right? And typically you can tell that this is a fat crystal change because you can put your finger on the outside of it for just a minute, and that white will disappear because the chocolate melts slightly. So how do we temper chocolate? We're looking for one particular type of crystal, and that's the type 5 crystal that we want. This is a graph of the amount of time as we go down, and then this is temperature at the top. Each of these fat crystal morphologies melts at a different temperature. And type 5 is the most thermodynamically stable, doesn't have the highest melting point, but it gives us that melting profile that we're used to where it melts on our palate. So we start up here at the beginning. We want to heat our chocolate to above 35 degrees C. So we've melted all of the fat crystal types that are there. We're going to cool it down to just above 25, and then we have this mixture of fat crystals. But we only want type 5, which is here in the blue. We heat it up slightly to melt those gray crystals, and we're individually selecting for type 5s. Once we've got only type 5 crystals, we can cool it back down, and all the rest of the crystals will fall into the same shape as this type 5 crystal. In essence, we're selecting the crystal we want there. The other way that this is possible is by seeding the mixture. So we talked about this with supersaturation of sugar solutions, and then seeding that sugar solution with adding sugar crystals into the supersaturated solution. We can do the same thing with chocolate, where we melt all of the crystals, and then we're going to add back in some chocolate that has the type of crystals we like. So we'll have to cool it back down so we don't melt all those crystals, right? And we cool it back down, and at this point we would add in the crystals that we would like, right? That type 5 crystal, and all of the other crystals would all of the other fat molecules would form into that type 5 crystal because we've seeded it. So there's two ways that you can handle that, and your book has a great description of exact temperatures and how to go about this in it. So I take a look at that. This is also a great video to show you the difference in pliability and texture and appearance of that chocolate when it's improperly tempered and when it's properly tempered. So selecting for the correct type of chocolate crystal is really important and not that easy. It's quite tricky. The other thing I wanted to talk about with you is what happens to liquid chocolate when we've melted it down and a little bit of water gets in it. Because this is a great way to think about the macro structure within chocolate. What's crystalline, what's particulate, what's liquid. So a small amount of sugar, if you melt down chocolate to this nice smooth liquid state, a small amount of water will cause it to seize, just like here in this picture. So this chocolate is seized and it turns into this solid, pasty, grainy structure. It is a big mess. So let's think about the components of chocolate and what just a little bit of water, adding a liquid to a liquid, can cause this to happen. Why is that? So if we think about the components, we have cocoa fat, cocoa butter, which is water repelling. It's hydrophobic. It doesn't want anything to do with water. Sugar particles are in there and they love water. So any water that is in the system is going to go right to the sugar particles. Cocoa particles, we're not really sure. Are they hydrophobic? Are they hydrophilic? Not really clear on that. And then the last portion of this is lecithin. So oftentimes on chocolate labels, you will see lecithin added, and it is added because it is an emulsifier. You may not think of this system as needing an emulsifier, but these sugar particles and the cocoa butter don't want to interact with each other. One is hydrophobic and one is hydrophilic. This is the definition of what emulsifiers do, right? They interact with hydrophobic things and hydrophilic things and bring them together so they can be in closer proximity to each other and be stable. So that's what's happening there. So let's get a visual of this type of system. All right. So without any water, this is what we have. And there's very, very little water in chocolate. So this is basically what the system looks like. These squiggly long red lines are going to be your cocoa fat. So these are hydrophobic. Our brown particles are the particles of fiber and cocoa that are in there. Our little squares, white squares, are our sucrose molecules, crystals. And then this is our emulsifier, the lecithin that's present. So you can see the lecithin surrounds the sugar crystal. So these hydrophilic heads here are surrounding the hydrophilic sucrose. And then the hydrophobic tail of the lecithin is interacting with the cocoa fat that's present, right? So this is basically an emulsion of a hydrophilic solid and a hydrophobic solid as well. Two crystalline systems that have very different needs. Now, when we add in water, where do you think that water goes? That water goes immediately to the hydrophobic or hydrophilic portions of the system, and that's sucrose. And it has the effect of attracting other sucrose compounds, right? So now we have this block of crystalline sucrose, a little bit of water attached to it and surrounded by emulsifiers. This is definitely detectable by your palate. And this is why we turn into this gritty paste, right? Opposite of what you would think. But the aggregation of these crystals really turns it from a liquid system into a solid system. But can you fix it? That's always the big question. What happens if you are melting chocolate and you get a little bit of water into it? Can you fix it? You can turn it back into this by adding more water to the system. All right, so if we add more water to the system, that sugar actually then dissolves. The crystalline sugar dissolves in the water. And now we have all of the hydrophobic things, the cocoa particles and the cocoa butter surrounded by the emulsifier in a water system. And we've done essentially the same thing that we did when we made our whipping cream into butter. We've totally flipped the system around, right? So we've phase inverted the system to be fat in water emulsion. But can you use it the same way? You can't. This, even though it makes a great chocolate sauce and you can use it for other things, it's never going to be a solid system again. You cannot cool it down and turn it back into a solid. It will always remain a liquid. So even though you can save it, if you get a little bit of chocolate or a little bit of water into your chocolate, it's never going to be the same again. Right? So we can't use it the same way. So that's a little bit about chocolate. There's great information in your book. If you want to know more, read up in your book. There's great stuff in there about the history of chocolate and more specifics about molecules and compounds and how they're interacting to create the flavor and texture we do today. So let's think about ice cream a little bit. This is our other very complex system that we're finishing with. So if you prepare ice cream, what do? And if we had lab, we would have. So the first thing you do is add all of the ingredients together. Typically, this is going to be milk, some type of sugar and flavoring. Sometimes you're going to add some type of large polymeric carbohydrate or protein in there. Gelatin is sometimes added. Things like xanthan gum or guar gum are often added. Added additional protein from milk powders or whey powders are added in very frequently. So once we get all of these things mixed together, we typically heat them up. We want to make sure we store them. This is a critical part of making ice cream, and this is even done industrially. So the ice cream mix, once it's been prepared and heated and everything has been dissolved, is allowed to age for 3 to 24 hours, and typically at least overnight. Of course, this is done at refrigerator temperatures 4 degrees C. This does a couple of things for this mixture. Make sure that all the ingredients are solubilized, and this is really important when we start talking about these larger polymeric compounds that we've added or added proteins. We want to make sure that it's interacting with the water and it's coming to some equilibrium as much as possible. It also acts to solidify the butterfat that's there. And this is important, we'll see in just a minute, because the butterfat is actually making a three-dimensional network within this ice cream. And by allowing these two things to happen, we're going to generate a smoother texture in the end product and a resistance to melting. So after this aging process is done, we're going to churn the ice cream and freeze it. Churning is actually adding in quite a bit of air. So ice cream is a foam. By churning this ice cream, you add in a bunch of air and increase the overrun percentage, right? Remember at the beginning of the semester, we measured overrun to determine how much air had been added into our foams. The same thing can be said about ice cream. And if you go to the ice cream aisle and pick up a couple of different cartons of ice cream that are the same size, you can see a difference in weight on them, okay? This has to do with overrun. Air is much cheaper, of course. And so the more air you add in, the cheaper the product will be to make. There is a limit, however, due to the standard of identity set by the federal government. So keep that in mind. Once you've got your ice cream churned and frozen, then you'll put it in the freezer to really harden, because the churning process and freezing process just creates ice crystals. It doesn't freeze the entire matrix. So let's think about that crystal formation. We want the texture to be smooth, and we want to increase the stability of the system. And so this mimics what we saw with our supersaturated solution in forming crystals, say in something like fudge. We want the number of nuclei to be high, right? So the number of little seed crystals there to be high. And we want all the crystals to be relatively small. So we want a narrow size distribution because we want that ice cream to be smooth. The bigger the crystals are, the more likely that your palate will detect them. And keep in mind that we will see growth of those crystals in storage. And this has to do with some of those same principles that we were looking at with foams and air distribution, right? The same types of principles can be applied to ice crystals and ice cream. So the key to this is to make sure that we're freezing ice cream really fast. We want to freeze really fast so we get a high number of nuclei and we get a very narrow size distribution. Also, as the ice cream freezes, these butterfat crystals that are in the system, remember we aged the ice cream mix overnight at refrigerated temperatures in order to solidify the butterfat that was there. These fat crystals migrate to the surface of the fat droplets, and they start to poke holes through these droplets. We'll see this in an image in just a second. And this forms a network of fat globules because we have coalescence. A lot of these terms should be sounding familiar to you from the beginning of the semester when we talked about emulsions and foams. So the fat globules here, we're actually wanting them to coalesce. And remember that coalescence is the fat droplets stick together and that interface breaks. And so they are interacting as one big fat globule. So this allows a network to be formed. So what influences the coalescence of these fat droplets? And there's several things. First, the composition of that milk fat globule membrane. Remember back that the beurre blanc sauce, the only emulsifier that we had present there was the milk fat globule membrane. And so the composition of that can be quite different depending on how the milk has been treated and the type of cow it comes from. So that influences how sticky these fat globules are. How much emulsifier is present? Is it charged, right? If the droplets all have the same charge on them, then they're going to repel each other, right? So we need to be cognizant of that. How much fat is there? If we don't have low fat ice, if we don't have very much fat and we have low fat ice cream, this network of fat globules can't form. There's not enough there to do that. And then how are these fat globules coming together? Just by simple Brownian motion in a system? Or is there some other attractive force like opposite charges between the globules, right? So all of these things can influence whether our fat globules coalesce or whether they don't. And what we're looking at in a system is trying to get these fat globules to have crystals that poke through the membrane and actually all stick together. So if we have our fat globules here, they've been homogenized, they're distributed within the milk. Once we begin freezing them into ice cream, we get these crystals represented by these little lines poking through our membrane, right? This is our milk fat globule membrane around the outside. And they interact with each other. And so this crystalline system begins to form this network within it. These fat globules will actually move to the air interface because remember, the air is hydrophobic. So the fat globules will move to this air interface where we have proteins at the edge of this air interface as well, right? And then we start to see that we get this network of fat globules partially coalesced around droplets of air and ice crystals mixed in, right? So there's a lot of study regarding ice cream macrostructure and microstructure. And this is one of the hypotheses as to what's stabilizing the entire system. Because not only do we have an emulsion, but we also have a foam. And this makes this whole entire system very complicated. Add on top of that now we have multiple types of crystals present within it. And it gets even more complicated. So what's the structure of our ice cream look like? We have ice crystals in there. We have air cells. We have fat globules surrounding the crystals in the air cells, made up of these fatty acids. And then what's all the other stuff, right? Where does all that sugar go and flavor and all of that? So when we freeze things, we actually get a concentration of those other compounds, sucrose and flavors, in a liquid phase. And we have to get to a very low temperature, like -40, -20 degrees C, in order to really solidly freeze all of the ice cream. At temperatures where we're consuming the ice cream, your typical home freezer, this liquid phase here never really freezes solid. When ice crystals form, water is interacting with water, and it pushes out all the other solids. Right? So the only thing in these ice crystals is water. That means that the water that's remaining, that's hydrating the sucrose or other carbohydrates that are present, is still in a liquid phase. And as that sucrose concentration increases because water is being removed to crystallize, we get a very concentrated sucrose solution. Okay? And this is called the serum phase. That phase isn't frozen, and it includes all the sucrose and stabilizers and proteins there. So this is affected by colligative properties. Remember that it can be affected by water activity and things like that are definitely different. And the amount of stabilizer that's added. So that's those large carbohydrate compounds that we're adding, the hydrocolloids like guar gum and xanthan gum, or adding in lots of protein. For example, we could add in something like evaporated milk, where we have a higher protein concentration. The effect of having more protein present and having these hydrocolloids present is that it slows down molecular mobility of water. And so we make sure those ice crystals stay small. Remember, this is the same thing that we do by adding corn syrup to candies. We want to make sure we have small ice crystals. We add corn syrup in, or small sugar crystals, excuse me. We add corn syrup in to decrease molecular mobility. Okay? Same thing is happening here. We're adding in hydrocolloids like those gums, or adding in more protein. And this decreases molecular mobility of that water because it is bound. All right? So because we have these proteins and hydrocolloids there, we can form a type of gel in the serum phase. So now we have a network of fat crystals, right? Throughout, remember, a network is a three-dimensional interaction of these compounds to form an overall network or web of these types of materials. Now we can actually have a gel, which is a similar three-dimensional network, but it's in the serum phase, in the liquid phase, that has all these other compounds, carbohydrates and proteins, concentrated down in the liquid phase. So this actually inhibits recrystallization after melting, and these proteins can actually change the ice crystal shape and size. We can decrease the growth rate, which is exactly what we're looking for when we talk about long-term storage and possible temperature abuse, just like any consumer has when they purchase the ice cream and get it home to their freezer, unpack it from their car, and put it back in their freezer that's not as cold as the industrial freezers. Okay? So we can have lots of differences and changes within these ice crystals. And when we start talking about making low-fat ice creams, like Halo Top or some of the other low-fat ice creams, we can use these added proteins and hydrocolloids to keep it from getting so crystalline and to keep it soft by increasing the amount of serum phase that doesn't freeze when we put it in the freezer. All right? It has such a low freezing point. So just a little bit of information about chocolate and ice cream. This is the last lecture of the semester. So I hope you enjoyed learning about definitely two very complex systems. And we will have a few of these questions on the test, but they'll be related to things that are interrelated to topics we've talked about before, like the colloidal systems and the crystals. Okay? So I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday.